The day Daniel Whitmore raised his voice at my 8-year-old granddaughter was the day he learned that 72 years of patience has an edge to it, and that edge is razor sharp. I want to be clear about something before I tell this story. I am not a woman who loses her composure. My name is Elena Voss, and I have buried a husband, raised 3 children largely on my own after Raymond passed, survived a cancer diagnosis at 54, and managed to come out of every storm in my life with my dignity and my lipstick both intact. My neighbor Cheryl calls me unflappable. My daughter Renee says I have the emotional range of a marble statue, and she means it as a compliment mostly. I have never once, in 7 decades of living, made a scene in someone else's home. Until the afternoon Daniel Whitmore opened his mouth at Lily. It started, as most disasters do, with the best of intentions. My daughter Renee had been going through what she carefully referred to as a transitional period, which was her dignified way of saying that her marriage to Tom Whitmore was dissolving like sugar in hot water, slowly and then all at once. Tom had moved out 4 months prior. The house, a colonial in a suburb that always struck me as trying too hard, was now Renee's alone. And into that house, on a Thursday in late October, Tom's younger brother Daniel had decided to invite himself for a long weekend. I won't pretend I understood the logic. Daniel and Renee had never been close. He was Tom's brother, technically Renee's brother-in-law, and their relationship had always existed in that cautious, polite corridor between family and stranger. But Tom had called Renee and explained, his voice carrying that particular combination of guilt and convenience, that Daniel was passing through the state, that he had nowhere else to stay, and that it would only be 2 days. Renee, because she is her mother's daughter, and was raised to be gracious even when grace costs her something, had agreed. I arrived on Friday afternoon to help with Lily, who was 8 and home from school with a cold that wasn't quite bad enough for bed, but wasn't quite good enough for a classroom. Lily was my particular joy in the world. She had Raymond's eyes, that pale, watchful grey, and my stubbornness, which her mother considered both a blessing and a curse depending on the day. She was sitting on the kitchen floor when I got there, surrounded by coloured pencils, working very seriously on a drawing of what she told me was a dragon who is also a librarian. I made her soup, I made myself tea. Renee was upstairs on a work call. The house was peaceful in the way that only afternoon houses can be, golden light through the windows, and the smell of something autumnal that Renee had burning in a wax warmer on the counter. Daniel arrived at 3:30. I had met Daniel Whitmore perhaps 5 or 6 times over the course of Renee's marriage. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered in the way of men who were athletic in their 20s and haven't quite let go of that identity. He had a loud laugh and the confident posture of a man who had never once second-guessed himself in a social situation. He was not unkind, precisely. He was simply the kind of man who filled rooms in ways that didn't leave a lot of space for anyone else. He walked in through the side door, already an overstep. That door was for family and close friends, not weekend guests, dropped his bag on the floor with a crash that made Lily jump, and opened the refrigerator before he'd even said hello. I said, "Hello, Daniel." He said, "Elena, didn't know you'd be here," which was not technically a greeting. I introduced him to Lily, who looked up from her dragon librarian with the measured assessment of a child, deciding whether an adult is worth her attention. "She's sick," I said. "She's been drawing all afternoon. She's been very good." Daniel looked at Lily. Lily looked at Daniel. There was a brief, civilized impasse. "Cool," he said, and went back to the refrigerator. We managed for the next 2 hours a kind of armed neutrality. Renee came downstairs, handled the uncomfortable geometry of greeting her almost ex-husband's brother with a warmth I privately admired, and started making dinner. Lily migrated from the floor to the kitchen table, still drawing. I sat with her, occasionally answering questions about what colour a dragon librarian's cardigan ought to be. We agreed on forest green. The kitchen was not, I will grant you, perfectly tidy. There were coloured pencils across the table. There was the pot I'd used for Lily's soup, rinsed but sitting in the sink. There was a glass Lily had used for juice, and one I'd used for tea, and the small crumb debris of the crackers she'd had with her soup. It was the comfortable disorder of a house that was actually being lived in by a sick child on a Friday afternoon. Renee was at the stove, I was at the table. Lily was drawing. Daniel had settled himself on the couch in the adjoining family room, from which he had a clear sightline into the kitchen. And then he said it. He didn't raise his voice to a shout, exactly. It was more than that. It was the tone of a man who is accustomed to giving orders and having them received without question. It was loud and flat and carried no room in it for negotiation. "Hey kid, clean up your mess at the table." Everything stopped. Lily looked up, her pencil went still. She is 8 years old. She had a mild fever. She had been sitting quietly in her own mother's house for 3 hours, hurting no one, drawing a dragon in a cardigan. And this man, this guest, this near stranger, had spoken to her the way you might speak to an inconvenience. I watched her face do something I recognized. I had seen it in Renee at that age. The quick reckoning, the checking, is this real? Is this my fault? And then the beginning of that particular, heartbreaking fold inward that children do when an adult makes them feel small. Renee had gone rigid at the stove. And something in me, something that I had kept carefully managed and properly latched for 7 decades, came fully unlatched. I set down my tea. I stood up. I am 5 feet 4 inches tall. I weigh what I have always weighed. I was wearing a cardigan, not unlike the one Lily had chosen for her dragon, as it happens. I am 72 years old. By most external metrics, I am not a particularly imposing figure. But I have buried a husband and beaten cancer, and raised 3 children on a teacher's salary. And when I walked into that family room, Daniel Whitmore looked up from his phone, and something in his expression shifted before I had said a single word. "Daniel," I said, my voice was very quiet. "I need you to hear me clearly." He started to say something dismissive, something that began with, "I was just." "No," I said, "you're going to listen." He closed his mouth. I stood in front of him, and I chose every word with the precision of a woman who has been holding words in reserve for a very long time. "That child," I said, "has a fever. She has been sitting in her mother's kitchen in her mother's house all afternoon, causing no trouble and bothering no one. She is 8 years old. You are a guest here, a guest, Daniel, in a house that belongs to my daughter, who was kind enough to open her home to you despite having absolutely no obligation to do so. Lily did not leave a mess. She left the ordinary evidence of a child existing, which is not the same thing. And even if it were, even if that table were covered in every colored pencil in this country, it would not be your place, under any circumstances, to speak to my granddaughter in that tone." He opened his mouth again. "I'm not finished," I said. He shut it. "I don't know how things worked in the house you grew up in. I don't know what Tom and your parents modeled for you about how adults speak to children. What I know is that you just made a sick little girl feel ashamed for existing in her own home. And I am telling you right now that it will not happen again this weekend. Not while I am in this house. Not while her mother is in this house. The next time you feel the impulse to direct anything at my granddaughter that isn't kind, patient, or completely silent, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that I am watching. And I want you to understand that I am significantly less polite than I appear." The room was absolutely silent. Renee had turned from the stove. She was holding a wooden spoon and looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Daniel said slowly, "I was just trying to help clean up." I looked at him. "Were you?" It was not a question. He looked away first. "Then you could," I said, "have offered to help clean up. You could have said to me or to Renee, 'Can I give anyone a hand?' You could have said nothing at all. Those were all available options. What you chose to do was issue a command to a child who is not yours and who does not answer to you. Those are different things, Daniel, very different things." I let the silence stand for another moment, a long moment, the kind that has weight and texture. Then I smoothed my cardigan, returned to the kitchen, sat down beside Lily and said, "What color do you think the librarian dragon's glasses should be? I'm thinking gold frames." Lily looked at me. Her eyes were the same pale grey as Raymond's, and in that moment they were full of something warm and steady that made my chest hurt with loving her. "Gold," she said quietly, "definitely gold." Daniel helped clean up after dinner. He did it without being asked, and he did it quietly, and he said good night to Lily when she went to bed in a voice that was careful and appropriately subdued. Renee walked me to my car at 9 o'clock. The night was cold and clear, the kind of autumn night that smells like leaves and distant wood smoke. She hugged me in the driveway. She held on for a long moment. "Mom," she said into my shoulder. "Don't," I said, "you'd have done the same." "I froze," she said. "I just froze. I didn't know what to say." "You've been managing an impossible situation for 4 months," I said. "You're allowed to freeze. That's what I'm here for." She pulled back and looked at me. In the porch light, she looked younger than she was, and also somehow older, and I was struck, as I am periodically struck throughout a life of loving someone, by how fully and fiercely I would do anything for her. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "That you're watching?" I smiled at her. "I always mean what I say." She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, the laugh she has had since she was Lily's age. Daniel left Sunday morning, earlier than planned. He said his goodbyes to Renee with the careful courtesy of a man who had been reminded of certain things and had taken those reminders to heart. He didn't look at me for very long, which I thought was wise of him. Lily gave him a wave from the couch, magnanimous in the way of children who have processed a thing and moved cleanly past it. She was, by Sunday, nearly fully recovered from her cold. Before he got in his car, Daniel paused on the porch. He looked back at me where I was standing in the doorway. "She's something, your granddaughter," he said. "Yes," I agreed, "she is." He nodded, got in the car, drove away. Lily's Dragon Librarian is hanging on my refrigerator now. Gold glasses, forest green cardigan, an enormous set of wings that she added as a last flourish because, as she explained with great seriousness, even librarians need to be able to fly somewhere. Renee framed a copy for herself. She texted me a photo of it hung on her kitchen wall with the message, "For both of us." I have thought often, since that afternoon, about what it means to intervene. I was raised to believe that stepping into someone else's conflict was presumptuous, that composure was its own form of dignity, that the quiet path was usually the right one. I believe most of that still. But I have also lived long enough to know that there are moments when a child is watching, when someone small is in the process of learning what the world is going to ask of them, and in those moments, silence isn't dignity, it's abandonment. Lily learned something that Friday afternoon. I hope she learned that the women in her family show up, that anger in the right hands and for the right reasons can be a form of love, that she's worth someone standing up and saying, clearly and without apology, "Not her, not in this house, not on my watch." I am 72 years old. I have plenty of patience left. But I know now, and I think I have always known, exactly where the edge of it is. And it is exactly there, standing between my granddaughter and anyone who would make her feel small. Elena Voss is a retired school librarian living in the Midwest. She has 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and very definite opinions about the appropriate tone of voice to use with children.